Sarah Mitchell adjusted her press helmet one final time as the helicopter descended toward the makeshift landing zone. The red dust swirled around the aircraft, creating a haze that matched the uncertainty in her stomach. Below, the conflict zone stretched endlessly, marked by broken buildings and scattered military vehicles that looked like toys from this height. She had been a war correspondent for 3 years, but this assignment felt different. The editor's words still echoed in her mind from their last conversation in the newsroom, back in New York. This isn't just another conflict, Sarah. The world needs to know what's happening in this forgotten corner. You're our best field reporter. The helicopter touched down with a jarring thud. Sarah grabbed her camera bag and notebook, thanking the pilot who barely looked at her as he prepared for immediate takeoff. The moment her boots hit the ground, the aircraft was already lifting away, leaving her alone with a small group of international peacekeepers who would escort her to the forward base. Captain Rodriguez, a weathered man in his 40s, approached her with a firm handshake. "Miss Mitchell, welcome to what we call the edge of nowhere. I've read your previous reports from other zones. Your work on the refugee crisis last year was remarkable." Sarah nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement but keeping her focus sharp. "Thank you, Captain. I'm here to document the truth, whatever that might be. How bad is the situation really?" When hard baby, the captain's expression grew serious as they walked toward a military jeep. "Worse than what makes it to the international news. The local population is caught between 3 different factions, and civilians are paying the heaviest price. Yesterday alone, we documented 17 attacks on medical facilities and schools." As they drove through the dusty roads, Sarah observed everything with the trained eye of someone who had seen too much human suffering. Children played in the rubble of what once were their homes, their laughter a stark contrast to the destruction around them. Women carried water containers on their heads, walking miles for what should be a basic necessity. Old men sat in the shade of damaged buildings, their eyes holding stories that could fill volumes. The forward base was a collection of tents and temporary structures surrounded by sandbags and razor wire. It housed journalists, aid workers, and military personnel from various countries, all united by the common goal of either documenting or alleviating the crisis. Sarah's quarters were a small tent that she would share with Elena Vasquez, a photographer from Spain who had been covering the conflict for 2 months. Elena greeted her with a tired smile and a cup of instant coffee that tasted like salvation after the long journey. "First time in this particular hell?" Elena asked, settling onto her cot with her own cup. "First time here, but not my first war zone," Sarah replied. "What should I know that isn't in the briefing reports?" Elena's expression became thoughtful. "The official reports tell you about the factions and the political situation. What they don't tell you is how quickly things can change here. One moment you're interviewing a family about their struggles, the next moment you're running for cover because someone decided to shell the area." That evening, Sarah attended the daily briefing where correspondents and aid workers shared information. The atmosphere was professional but tense, with everyone aware that tomorrow could bring unexpected dangers. She learned about safe routes, communication protocols, and the locations of medical facilities. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a surgeon with Doctors Without Borders, provided updates on the medical situation. "We're treating an average of 40 wounded civilians per day," he reported. "Most injuries are from improvised explosive devices and small arms fire. We're also dealing with malnutrition among children and a growing number of psychological trauma cases." After the briefing, Sarah walked around the perimeter of the base, getting a feel for her new environment. The night sky was clearer than anything she had seen in years, unmarred by the light pollution of major cities. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost wrong given the circumstances below. She thought about her family back home, particularly her younger sister who worried constantly about her career choice. "Why can't you just cover local news?" her sister had asked during their last conversation. Sarah had tried to explain that some stories could only be told from the ground, that the world needed witnesses to these forgotten conflicts. The next morning brought her first assignment. She would accompany a humanitarian convoy delivering supplies to a village that had been cut off for 3 weeks. The convoy consisted of 4 vehicles carrying food, medical supplies, and water purification tablets. Sarah rode in the second vehicle with two aid workers, Maria from Italy and James from Canada. Both had been working in conflict zones for years and shared stories during the bumpy ride that helped her understand the complex dynamics of the region. The villagers we're going to see today have been caught in the middle of this for 8 months, Maria explained. They've lost their school, their clinic, and most of their livestock. But they refuse to leave because this land has been in their families for generations. The village of Al-Rashid appeared gradually through the heat haze, its traditional adobe buildings showing the scars of conflict. Several structures had partially collapsed walls, and Sarah could see bullet holes peppering the walls that remained standing. Despite the damage, there were signs of life everywhere. The convoy's arrival triggered immediate activity. Children ran toward the vehicles with excitement that transcended the harsh realities of their situation. Women emerged from buildings, many wearing traditional clothing that was dusty but carefully maintained. Men gathered in small groups, their faces showing a mixture of gratitude and wariness. Sarah spent the morning documenting the distribution of supplies and conducting interviews. She spoke with Fatima, a schoolteacher who was trying to continue classes in her damaged home. "We use whatever materials we can find," Fatima explained, showing Sarah a collection of books with pages missing and notebooks made from scraps of paper. The teacher's determination reminded Sarah of educators she had met in other conflict zones, people who refused to let violence destroy their children's futures. She photographed Fatima working with a group of students who sat on the floor, their attention focused despite the challenging circumstances. Around midday, Sarah interviewed the village elder, a man named Abu Hassan, whose weathered hands gestured expressively as he spoke about his community's struggles. "We have been here for 70 years, he told her. "My father built this house with his own hands. We will not abandon it, because others choose violence." His words carried the weight of generational attachment to place, something Sarah had encountered in many conflict zones but never stopped finding moving. She made careful notes, knowing that his story represented thousands of similar stories across the region. The afternoon brought interviews with mothers who described the challenges of keeping their families fed and safe. Sarah spoke with Amira, who had 3 young children and whose husband had been missing for 2 months. "Every morning, I wake up, hoping he will return," Amira said. "But every evening, I must be strong for my children, who ask when their father is coming home." These personal accounts were what made Sarah's reporting powerful. She had learned early in her career that statistics and political analysis, while important, could not capture the human cost of conflict the way individual stories could. Her readers needed to understand that behind every casualty number was a family torn apart, a dream deferred, a future uncertain. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed increased radio chatter among the convoy's security detail. Captain Rodriguez, who had accompanied the mission, seemed more alert and frequently checked his communications equipment. When she asked about it, he assured her it was routine monitoring. The return journey began in the late afternoon, with the convoy loaded with villagers who needed medical treatment at the base hospital. An elderly man with diabetes who hadn't had medication in weeks sat next to Sarah, his family grateful that he could finally receive proper care. During the drive, Sarah reviewed her notes and photos from the day. She had enough material for a comprehensive article about the village's situation, complete with personal stories that would help readers understand the conflict's impact on ordinary people. However, as they approached a narrow valley about halfway back to base, Captain Rodriguez suddenly raised his hand, signaling the convoy to stop. Through her window, Sarah could see him speaking intensely into his radio, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "What's happening?" Maria whispered, noticing the change in atmosphere. Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the valley. Captain Rodriguez was already moving, his weapon ready as he directed the convoy to take defensive positions. The peaceful day was about to transform into something far more dangerous. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She secured her equipment and prepared for whatever was coming, her mind already shifting from observer to survivor. In conflict zones, the line between documenting danger and experiencing it was often razor-thin. The approaching vehicles grew louder, their engines suggesting heavy modifications typical of militia groups in the region. Through the dust they kicked up, Sarah could make out several trucks carrying armed men who didn't appear to be wearing any official military uniforms. This was the moment every war correspondent both feared and prepared for, when the story they were covering suddenly became the story they were living. Sarah gripped her camera, knowing that whatever happened next would test every skill she had learned in 3 years of covering conflicts around the world. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley as the unknown vehicles drew closer, and Sarah Mitchell realized that her assignment as an observer was about to become something entirely different. The first shots cracked through the afternoon air like thunder, shattering the relative peace that had filled the valley moments before. Sarah ducked instinctively as bullets struck the side of their vehicle, the metallic ping of impact mixing with shouts from the convoy's security team. Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos with military precision. "Contact left. 3 vehicles, approximately 15 hostiles. Take cover behind the convoy." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she scrambled from the vehicle, keeping low as training from her previous assignments kicked in. The convoy had stopped in the worst possible location, a narrow section of valley with steep, rocky slopes on both sides that provided perfect cover for attackers. The humanitarian workers moved with practiced efficiency, having faced similar situations before. Maria grabbed the medical bag while James helped the elderly villagers find shelter behind the largest vehicle. The convoy's security detail, consisting of 4 peacekeepers, took defensive positions with their weapons ready. Through the dust and confusion, Sarah could see the attacking vehicles more clearly now. 3 pickup trucks modified with armor plating and mounted weapons, carrying men in mismatched uniforms and equipment that suggested they belonged to one of the local militia groups rather than any official military force. "Who are they?" Sarah shouted to Captain Rodriguez, who was coordinating the defense from behind the lead vehicle. "Unknown militia. Possibly the group that's been harassing supply convoys for the past month," he replied, his eyes scanning the rocky slopes for movement. "They usually want the supplies, not a firefight. But this attack felt different from the beginning. Instead of demanding surrender or negotiation, the militia had opened fire immediately. Their positioning suggested they had been waiting specifically for this convoy, which meant someone had provided them with intelligence about the humanitarian mission. Sarah pressed herself against the wheel of their vehicle, her camera in her hands more from habit than conscious decision. Even in the middle of being attacked, her instincts as a journalist remained sharp. This was exactly the kind of incident that illustrated the dangers faced by humanitarian workers in the region. The firefight intensified as the militia members began advancing down the slopes, using the rocky terrain for cover. Their tactics showed more organization than typical opportunistic bandits, with coordinated movement and covering fire that suggested military training. Captain Rodriguez was speaking rapidly into his radio, calling for backup from the main base. But Sarah knew that help was at least 30 minutes away, and the current situation could change dramatically in much less time than that. "We need to move to better positions," the captain announced. "This location is too exposed." The plan was to move the convoy further up the valley, where a cluster of large boulders would provide better defensive cover. But executing the movement while under fire required precise coordination and considerable risk. James was helping an elderly woman from the village when a burst of automatic fire struck near his position, sending fragments of rock flying. One piece caught him in the shoulder, and he stumbled backward with a cry of pain. Without thinking, Sarah moved from her cover toward James, her body acting on instinct to help someone in need. As she reached him, she realized that one of the attacking militia members had positioned himself on a ledge with a clear line of sight to their location. The man was raising his rifle, clearly intending to target the clustered humanitarian workers and villagers. Time seemed to slow as Sarah's mind processed the immediate threat and the available options. During her first assignment in a conflict zone 2 years earlier, Sarah had spent time with a military unit that included a sniper instructor. Sergeant Williams had taught several journalists basic marksmanship skills, explaining that in extreme situations, the ability to accurately use a weapon could mean the difference between documenting a story and becoming a casualty. "Most people think shooting accurately is about strength or aggression," Sergeant Williams had said during one training session. "Actually, it's about breathing, focus, and understanding that every shot has consequences. The best marksmen are calm under pressure and think before they act." Sarah had practiced extensively during that assignment, discovering that she had a natural aptitude for precision shooting. Her steady hands, developed through years of photography requiring precise focus, translated well to marksmanship. What surprised her most was how calm she felt while aiming, the same focused concentration she experienced while composing a perfect photograph. Now, with James bleeding beside her and the militia member clearly preparing to fire into the group of civilians, Sarah's training took over. One of the peacekeepers had dropped his rifle during the movement to new cover, and it lay within reach. She grabbed the weapon, checked that it was loaded, and took a firing position behind a low rock wall. The militia member on the ledge was approximately 200 meters away, a challenging shot even under ideal conditions. But Sarah's mind had shifted into the same focused state she entered while working on difficult photography assignments. Her breathing steadied automatically as she acquired the target through the rifle's scope. The first shot needed to count, because missing would draw the attention of other militia members and potentially make the situation worse for everyone she was trying to protect. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, despite the months since her last practice session. Sarah adjusted for wind and distance, remembering Sergeant Williams' instructions about follow-through and maintaining sight picture after firing. Her first shot struck the militia member's center mass, and he dropped immediately. The accuracy surprised even her. But there was no time to reflect on what had just happened. Two other attackers had seen their companion fall and were moving to new positions. The second target appeared between rocks about 150 meters away, carrying what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. If he managed to get that weapon into action, the convoy would be devastated. Sarah's second shot caught him in the upper chest as he attempted to aim the RPG. The weapon fell from his hands and clattered down the rocky slope, harmlessly exploding against a boulder far from any people. The remaining militia members seemed confused by the sudden, accurate fire coming from the convoy's position. They had clearly not expected to encounter trained marksmen among the humanitarian workers, and their advance faltered as they tried to locate the source of the threat. Sarah identified a third target attempting to flank their position from the right side of the valley. This shot required leading the moving target, something that demanded even more precision and timing. She tracked his movement carefully, waiting for the moment when he would pause to take aim at the convoy. When the militiaman stopped behind a boulder and raised his weapon, Sarah was ready. Her third shot struck him before he could fire, and he collapsed behind his cover. The psychological impact of losing 3 members to accurate long-range fire was clearly affecting the remaining attackers. Instead of continuing their assault, they began withdrawing toward their vehicles, apparently deciding that whatever they had hoped to accomplish wasn't worth facing an unknown sniper. Captain Rodriguez had noticed the sudden change in the tactical situation and was directing his peacekeepers to maintain defensive positions while the militia retreated. He looked around for the source of the precise shooting that had turned the tide of the engagement. "Who's been taking those shots?" he called out. Sarah realized that, in the chaos of the firefight, no one had seen her move to the firing position. The peacekeepers had been focused on their own sectors of responsibility, and the humanitarian workers had been protecting the villagers. Before she could respond, movement on the far ridge caught her attention. One of the militia members had positioned himself with what appeared to be a sniper rifle of his own, clearly trying to identify and eliminate whoever had been picking off his companions. The range was much greater now, nearly 300 meters, and the target was partially concealed behind rocks. This would be the most challenging shot yet, requiring Sarah to compensate for bullet drop over the extended distance. She adjusted her position slightly to get a better angle and controlled her breathing even more carefully. Through the scope, she could see the militia sniper scanning the convoy area, his rifle moving as he searched for targets. Sarah's fourth shot required holding slightly high to account for the bullet's trajectory over the longer distance. When she squeezed the trigger, she watched through the scope as the bullet found its mark, and the enemy sniper disappeared behind his rocky cover. The fifth target appeared almost immediately, another militia member attempting to recover the fallen sniper's weapon. Sarah's shot caught him as he reached for the rifle, preventing him from continuing the long-range threat. With their sniper eliminated and several other members down, the remaining militia members began a more organized retreat toward their vehicles. But they were trying to carry their wounded, which meant they were moving slowly and providing additional targets. Sarah's sixth shot disabled one of the militia members who was attempting to provide covering fire for the retreat. Her seventh struck another who was trying to start one of the trucks. The remaining attackers abandoned any attempt at an organized withdrawal and simply ran for their vehicles, leaving their wounded behind. Sarah had clear shots at several of them but made a conscious decision not to fire on fleeing opponents who no longer posed an immediate threat. However, as the militia members reached their trucks, one of them grabbed what looked like a heavy machine gun from the back of a vehicle. If he managed to get that weapon into action, he could still cause significant casualties even during a retreat. Sarah's eighth shot struck the militiaman as he was lifting the heavy weapon, causing him to drop it before he could bring it to bear on the convoy. The ninth shot disabled another attacker who was attempting to use a vehicle-mounted weapon. The final two shots came as the militia members were attempting to start their remaining vehicles. Sarah aimed for the drivers, understanding that immobilizing their transportation would prevent them from regrouping and potentially attacking other humanitarian convoys in the future. Her 10th shot struck the driver of the lead truck, and the 11th hit the driver of the second vehicle. With their transportation disabled and most of their fighters either wounded or in full retreat, the surviving militia members disappeared into the rocky terrain on foot. The sudden silence that followed the engagement was almost as startling as the initial gunfire had been. The valley that had echoed with automatic weapons, fire, and shouting now held only the sound of wind through the rocks and the distant calls of birds. Sarah set down the rifle with hands that were steady despite what she had just experienced. The focused calm that had carried her through the shooting was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of what had actually happened. Captain Rodriguez approached her position, his expression mixing disbelief with professional admiration. "Miss Mitchell, did you just engage 11 hostile targets with 11 consecutive hits?" Sarah looked at the rifle in her hands, then at the rocky slopes where the militia members had been positioned. The evidence was clear, but the reality of what she had done was still sinking in. "I counted 11 shots, and we can confirm 11 targets eliminated or disabled," she replied quietly. "I had training, but I never expected to use it like this." The humanitarian workers and villagers were beginning to emerge from cover, and James was being treated for his shoulder wound by Maria, who had medical training. Everyone was looking at Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. Elena, who had been documenting the attack with her camera, approached with wide eyes. "Sarah, I've been covering conflicts for 5 years, and I've never seen shooting like that. Where did you learn to shoot with that kind of precision?" As Sarah began to explain her background training, she realized that this incident would fundamentally change how she was perceived in the field. She had arrived as a war correspondent whose job was to observe and document, but in the space of a few minutes, she had become something entirely different. The radio crackled with incoming communications from the main base. Backup was still en route, but the immediate threat had been eliminated. Captain Rodriguez was already beginning to coordinate the collection of evidence and the medical treatment of wounded militia members who had been left behind. Sarah looked around at the convoy members and villagers who were alive because of her actions, and she understood that her role as a journalist had just become far more complicated than she had ever anticipated. The helicopter carrying backup forces arrived 45 minutes after the last shot had been fired, landing in a whirlwind of dust and urgent military precision. Sarah watched from her position near the convoy as armed soldiers deployed quickly, establishing a secure perimeter around the area. Major Collins, the commanding officer who stepped off the helicopter, was a career military man whose weathered face showed the experience of multiple combat deployments. He surveyed the scene with professional attention, noting the positions of the eliminated militia members and the tactical layout of the engagement. "Captain Rodriguez, report," he ordered, approaching the convoy's position. Ambush, initiated at approximately 1,545 hours by unknown militia force, Captain Rodriguez began. 11 hostile combatants engaged and neutralized by precision fire from a single friendly shooter. 0 friendly casualties except for 1 minor shrapnel wound. Humanitarian mission personnel and civilians all accounted for and safe. Major Collins raised an eyebrow at the report. "Single shooter eliminated 11 targets? Which of your peacekeepers accomplished that?" Captain Rodriguez glanced toward Sarah, who was sitting quietly on a supply crate, still processing what had happened. "Sir, The shots came from Miss Mitchell, the war correspondent attached to our mission. The Major's expression shifted from professional interest to genuine surprise. A journalist engaged in combat operations? Sir, the engagement was clearly defensive in nature, Captain Rodriguez explained. The militia had superior positioning and were threatening civilian lives. Miss Mitchell's actions prevented what could have been a massacre. Over the next several hours, Sarah found herself at the center of an investigation that was part military debrief and part journalistic interview. Military investigators documented the scene, photographed the positions of eliminated targets, and conducted ballistic analysis to confirm the accuracy of her shooting. Dr. Hassan, the surgeon who had accompanied the backup forces, examined the militia casualties to determine the nature of their wounds. His findings supported the testimony about Sarah's precision. Every shot placement shows remarkable accuracy, he reported to Major Collins. These are the work of an exceptional marksman, not random defensive fire. The wounded militia members who survived provided intelligence about their group's operations and motivations. Through interpreters, investigators learned that the attack had indeed been planned specifically for this convoy, based on inside information about the humanitarian mission's timing and route. This suggests a security breach in our operational planning, Major Collins told Sarah during one of their conversations. Your actions may have prevented these individuals from escaping with intelligence that could have endangered future missions. As evening approached, Sarah found herself sitting with Elena near the command post that had been established at the convoy site. Elena had been documenting the entire aftermath with her camera, creating a visual record that would complement whatever story Sarah eventually wrote about the day's events. How are you processing all this? Elena asked, her voice gentle with concern for her colleague. Sarah considered the question carefully. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving her with a complex mixture of emotions that she was still trying to understand. I keep thinking about the alternative, she said finally. If I hadn't acted, James might be dead. Some of those villagers might be dead. The militia could have escaped with information that would endanger other humanitarian workers. But you came here to document conflict, not participate in it, Elena pointed out. That's what I keep telling myself, Sarah replied. But when someone is about to shoot innocent people right in front of you, the line between observer and participant disappears pretty quickly. Major Collins approached them as they talked, carrying a folder that contained the preliminary investigation results. Miss Mitchell, I wanted to discuss the implications of today's events with you. He sat down across from them, his demeanor serious but not unfriendly. Your actions today saved lives and potentially prevented a much larger security incident. However, as a civilian journalist who engaged in combat operations, you've created a unique situation that requires careful consideration. Sarah nodded, understanding that her status had become complicated. What does that mean for my assignment here? From a legal standpoint, you acted in defense of civilians under imminent threat, which falls under international humanitarian law provisions, the Major explained. From a practical standpoint, word of your marksmanship skills will spread quickly through the various factions operating in this region. The implications were sobering. Sarah realized that her identity as a neutral observer might be permanently compromised. Militia groups and other armed factions would now view her as a potential military threat rather than a non-combatant journalist. There's another consideration, Major Collins continued. Your skills represent a significant tactical asset. We've confirmed that you achieved 11 hits on 11 targets at ranges from 100 to 300 meters, under combat stress, with unfamiliar equipment. That level of precision is rare even among trained military snipers. Elena looked between Sarah and the Major with growing understanding. You're suggesting she could work with military units rather than as an independent journalist. I'm suggesting she consider all her options, Major Collins replied diplomatically. The military has specialists who work in various capacities to support operations while maintaining technical civilian status. Major Collins, RPSLV. Sarah felt a profound shift occurring in how she viewed her future. The career path she had planned, built around objective journalism and independent reporting, suddenly seemed much more complicated. That evening, She called her editor in New York using the satellite communication equipment at the command post. The conversation was difficult, trying to explain the day's events to someone sitting in a comfortable office thousands of miles away. "Sarah, this is extraordinary," her editor said after hearing the full account. "But I'm concerned about how this affects your credibility as an objective journalist. If you're taking sides in conflicts, how can readers trust your reporting to be impartial?" "I wasn't taking sides in a political conflict," Sarah replied firmly. "I was stopping people from murdering humanitarian workers and civilians. There's a moral difference. I understand that. But perception matters in this business. Once word gets out that you've engaged in combat operations, every article you write will be viewed through that lens." Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew she would make the same choice again if faced with similar circumstances. Some situations transcended professional objectivity and demanded human action. The next morning brought a new complexity to her situation. Word of the previous day's engagement had indeed spread quickly through the region's communication networks. Sarah received messages from military units requesting her assistance with operations that required precision marksmanship. She also received threats from militia groups who viewed her as a legitimate military target rather than a protected journalist. The landscape of her assignment had changed fundamentally overnight. Captain Rodriguez found her reviewing these messages over breakfast. "It appears you've become quite famous in certain circles," he observed. "Famous isn't the word I'd use," Sarah replied wryly. "Complicated is more accurate. There's something else you should know," the captain continued. "Intelligence reports suggest that the militia group you encountered yesterday was part of a larger organization that's been targeting humanitarian operations throughout the region. Your actions may have disrupted a significant threat to civilian aid efforts." This information added another dimension to Sarah's understanding of what had occurred. Her split-second decisions during the ambush had apparently had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. Dr. Hassan approached their table with his morning coffee and a thoughtful expression. "I wanted to thank you again for yesterday," he said to Sarah. "But I also wanted to discuss something that might interest you." He sat down and continued. "Medical organizations operating in conflict zones face many of the same security challenges that you've now experienced. We often need people who can provide protection while understanding our humanitarian mission. Your combination of journalistic background and demonstrated tactical skills is quite unique." Sarah realized that multiple paths were opening before her, each representing a different way to contribute to the complex humanitarian crisis she had come to document. The traditional role of objective observer was still possible, but it would require accepting increased personal risk and potential limitations on her ability to access certain areas. "What would that kind of work involve?" she asked Dr. Hassan. "Security consultant for medical missions," he explained. "Someone who understands both the journalistic mission of documenting conditions and the practical requirements of keeping medical teams safe while they work." Elena had been listening to the conversation with interest. "That could actually enhance your reporting rather than compromise it," she suggested. "You'd have access to situations that most journalists never see, and your technical background would help you understand the challenges faced by humanitarian workers." Over the following days, Sarah found herself at the center of discussions about how to handle her unique situation. Military commanders wanted to recruit her skills for tactical operations. Humanitarian organizations were interested in her potential as a security consultant. Her own news organization was trying to determine how to maintain her credibility as an independent journalist. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Major Collins about the broader security situation in the region. "The real problem we face," he explained, "is that traditional military operations often can't distinguish between legitimate humanitarian work and potential military targets. We need people who understand both sides of that equation." Sarah began to see a possibility that hadn't occurred to her before. Instead of choosing between journalism and military work, she could potentially combine both into a new kind of reporting that focused specifically on the intersection between humanitarian operations and security challenges. "What if I continued as a journalist, but specialized in covering the security aspects of humanitarian work?" she proposed. "I could document both the challenges faced by aid workers and the tactical solutions being developed to address those challenges." This approach would allow her to use her demonstrated skills while maintaining her primary identity as a journalist. Her unique experience and proven abilities would give her access to sources and situations that other reporters couldn't reach. The more she considered this possibility, the more it seemed like a natural evolution of her career, rather than a complete change in direction. She had always been drawn to stories about people facing extraordinary challenges, and the intersection of humanitarian work and security operations certainly qualified. 2 weeks after the ambush, Sarah received confirmation that her news organization was willing to support this specialized focus. They recognized that her experience gave her unique credibility in covering security issues related to humanitarian operations. Her first article under this new focus examined how humanitarian organizations were adapting their security protocols in response to increasing threats. The piece combined her journalistic skills with tactical insights that could only come from someone who had experienced combat firsthand. The response from readers was overwhelmingly positive. The article provided perspectives on humanitarian security that had never been covered in mainstream media, giving readers a deeper understanding of the challenges faced by aid workers in conflict zones. More importantly for Sarah, the work felt meaningful in a way that transcended traditional journalism. She was documenting important stories while also contributing to the safety of people doing crucial humanitarian work. 6 months later, Sarah stood in another conflict zone, this time embedded with a medical team that was using new security protocols she had helped develop. Her camera hung around her neck alongside tactical equipment that had become as familiar as her notebook. She had found a way to maintain her identity as a journalist, while acknowledging that some situations required more than observation. The 11 shots she had fired that day in the valley had not ended her career as a war correspondent, but they had certainly transformed it into something she could never have anticipated. Looking back, Sarah realized that the moment she picked up that rifle had been a turning point not just in her career, but in her understanding of what it meant to be a witness to conflict. Sometimes bearing witness required more than just watching and documenting. Sometimes it required action. The story she had come to cover had become the story of how she discovered that the most important truths often emerged not from maintaining distance, but from accepting responsibility for the consequences of what you witnessed.